really excited tonight to present this program in our My America series in conjunction with our special exhibit, which if you haven't seen it is right back there, My America, Immigrant and Refugee Writers Today. And it brings together more than 30 different writers from all over the world who came to America, and we asked them about their experiences as writers and also their relationship to the idea of America and what America means to them. Tonight we're going to be talking to Madden, who's the author of Long Live the Tribe of Fatherless Girls and the founding editor of the No Tokens Journal, and Rowan Hisayo Buchanan, whose novels include the upcoming Starling Days, and she's the editor of the anthology that we're going to be talking about tonight a little bit called Go Home, a collection of writing by Asian authors writing about what home means to them. Welcome to both of you. First of all, can everyone in the back hear me? I'm pretty loud, so you're good? Okay, well, if you can't, just wave your arms around or something and let us know if you can't hear us. We're a little bit of more of an intimate gathering tonight, so we thought we'd dispense with the mics. Thank you both for being here.
Thank you. Thank you so much for being here and all of this.
We've around ourselves a lot, so we're very grateful.
We'll all go through the Lysol shower in the end. Yeah. So I wanted to start tonight by asking you, the name of the book is Go Home. I wanted to start by asking both of you what your idea of home is and what are the forces that shaped that idea for you both?
Sure. This is an answer that changes for me all the time, and I think we've talked about this through Rowan's whole process with this anthology, and I think I had a different answer then than I would have now even. I don't remember what that was. But for me, I think home is community and home is people. I've never really found my place as in a physical place because I was born and raised in South Florida, particularly Boca Raton, Florida, in which I never felt a sense of home at all. So I think throughout my life and through the years, I have found my people in different ways. I found my people culturally. I found my people in the writing community. I found hopper people like myself, like Rowan, and that feels like home when I'm with those people, as corny as that might sound.
That was really beautiful. So I'm also mixed race. My mom is half Japanese, half Chinese, but she grew up in America. My dad is a bunch of white people from Britain. I mean, one white man, but history. And I've lived in America and I've lived in the UK, and so I share a slight feeling of geographical lostness. And I talk in the opening of this book how for me for a long time I didn't feel like there was a place that was home. What I don't say is that, I'm a wuss and I'll be really sad and I want to go home. And my friends will be like, you are at home, what are you talking about? But I had this idea of this ideal home, a place where you felt safe and like you belonged. And for me, it sort of came in two different ways. One was books. I'm a nerd. I collected books by mixed race writers, by Asian American writers, by writers who felt like outsiders for other reasons, by queer writers. I was building myself a family of books. And as I got older and was able to make choices more about where I lived and who I knew, some of those writers became real writers I knew in real life who are very wonderful, and some became friends who don't write. And so for me, home has always been an effort. It's been like a verb. It's been a thing you do, a thing you seek out, rather than just a geographical place, I guess.
How did your both of your backgrounds, how did those influence your writing career?
I think most people of color or writers who've been marginalized in some way, I think many of us share the experience of not seeing ourselves represented on the page growing up. Those people have always been writing. I don't want to say that now we're having a moment that we didn't have before. Those people were always writing their stories and always making space for people like us who came later. But I think we can all agree that perhaps the curriculum we were assigned growing up did not reflect lives like ours. Did not maybe reflect mixed race people, marginalized people, queer people in a way that now after, I like what you said about finding family in books. But that takes time and that takes community. And I hope younger generations they might not have to wait as long because they'll have people like us pointing to it. But I didn't have that growing up. I grew up with Gone with the Wind was my text that I read. And I don't, I can see now, yes, this text is problematic, but it's also what made me interested in reading, and I'm grateful for that. But I'm more grateful for finding, people like us to see that visibility, to find it, and to then, I hope, amplify that visibility by not being a pundit or the one person who is X, Y, and Z, but to speak and write into a chorus of people who have felt not represented in art in that way. Does that make sense?
It does. Yes. I mean, I think when I was given the opportunity to edit this book, so much of what I wanted it to do was not to be like this definitive, like, best of Asians, and like, now there's no more room for you. We have taken it and won. I wanted it to be.
It should have been called Best of Asians.
Not even Best Asian writing, just Best Asian.
And I wanted it to be a door, and I did. That was huge for me. That I was trying to build like a mini version of my bookshelf, kind of a mini version of the bookshelf that I found really exciting. So that I hope that people would come to this book and they want to write their own stories. They want to write what was missing, but also they'd read there's an essay of T. Curious that's in here that at the time wasn't available, but now is also in her memoir, so that they read it and go, oh my God, I love this writer. This writer really speaks to me. I'm going to seek out more of her work. And so I hope that someone what's here does that. So I guess this is a plug for my anthology. But and I think as a writer, I find it really hard to know. I think one of the things I struggle with is that this is what I am. Like, sometimes I want to be able to explain what it is to be mixed race to people. I always was. I often don't even understand where I end and it begins. I was listening to Celeste Ng talk about, who's not mixed race, she's Asian American, talk about her cutlery drawer at home and how there was never enough room because there is enough space for forks and knives and spoons and teaspoons, and she has chopsticks. And I thought I was really bad at organizing my cutlery. Like, genuinely, I just thought I was disorganized. And I was like, no, that's not why. And so I think that's also what a community does for you. It lets you know where you're from. Sorry, that was a bit of a side note. So yeah, it's hard to know what it, but I think maybe what it is as a writer, it makes me very interested in outsiders and outside voices and people who are trying to understand the world.
What do you feel your relationship and responsibility is to the communities that you identify with, that you feel yourself a part of, in terms of, do you write for those specific communities? Do you find that influencing the process?
That's a great question. I find thinking that way I feel like I can't manage that personally. So I always have to push that away when I start feeling like I'm pandering or writing for a large community. It makes me feel like, oh, I'm trying to be a pundit in some way, and I'm not. I'm not the one voice that can speak to biracial lesbian Jewish experience, even though, to me growing up that felt like highly unique. I think the best I can do, and this is not the answer for everyone making art, but I can just imagine one person I'm writing for at a time. And sometimes that changes piece by piece, and sometimes that changes by genre. But for the most part, it's usually, it sounds silly, but it's a kid version of myself. I have a little picture of the little kid me, and I think about how can I offer grace to that person's experience who didn't have the resources that I have now, who didn't have the community or the home that I have now, to make that experience of child abuse, of sexual assault, of isolation worth something in this world. And it's writing for her the stories that she was trying to tell at the time, and writing them now in a way that I hope I can offer integrity and grace to those stories. So I can't think about that whole community, but I think if I'm writing honestly with vulnerability for that person, I am writing to that community, because those are the stories we kind of wish were bomb for us growing up.
every time she talks, I just like sit and think about it. And I was like, I have to say something. So I think for me, because I'm primarily a fiction writer, though I do write essays, and my essays probably are more directed, but my fiction comes almost like a dream or like a movie in my head. And when I am first writing, I'm writing for the characters, I'm writing for what would feel true for them. And like sometimes the main character of this book, Starling Days, is a bisexual Chinese American woman who's in a relationship with a mixed race man. And so sometimes that touches on community, but it's also like them specifically, their specific experiences. And like I have to believe that they're real almost when I'm writing it. I have to have, otherwise it starts to feel like a trick or fake. But I think sometimes later when I'm coming back, when I'm editing and I have to make a difficult choice, I think about that community. So in this book, she's married, and she falls for another woman. And my agent said, it's a bit difficult that happens. What if it was like a sexy friendship instead? And I had this moment of like extreme self-doubt where I thought, well, I want this book to be in the world. Does it have to be a sexy friendship to be in the world? And I thought about all of the women I knew personally who'd come to their sexuality later in life, it gave me strength to write it. I'm not saying this novel is the only way to do that. I think you're right, there is a very big danger in saying my story is the story, but I think there's that aspect. And similarly, I think I find that when I'm often writing to those identities, I'm writing towards vulnerability, which is something that really interests me. So my first book, Harmless Like You, is about a Japanese woman who abandons her son and how and why that happens. And it's also a lot about feeling like an outsider and trying to find your place. And my editor is a blonde woman with blue eyes, and she said, oh, this book spoke to me so much because I came from an English family, but I grew up in Scotland, and I was a weird person, and then I moved back to England, and I felt Scottish, and I didn't know where I was from, and I didn't in my head think I'm writing for this blonde woman who feels like an outsider, but I realized I was writing for people who felt that. That makes sense.
In whatever context they felt that, yeah.
And I also think people will always do that for us. There's comfort in categories, right? So people will say, you know, this is who you are as a writer and who you're writing for. They always do that. These are your topics. This is what you write about.
Your brand.
This is your brand, whatever it is. And people will say, you have a responsibility to X, Y, Z. So I think because of that, I try to push against that as much as possible because readership will do that. Media will do that.
Yeah. You write about these kinds of things, and therefore we know where to put you.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So
we talked you were generous enough to give your time this morning to some, we had a group of about 80 7th and 8th graders. And one of the teachers asked what I thought was a great question, which is, you know, you have all these different identities that claim you or that you claim. What about the identity of writer? How do you feel about that identity?
My answer earlier was that, I think imposter syndrome is really real for most of us. And I think the teacher asked, when did you look in the mirror and see a writer? And I said, you know, I think I felt more like a writer when I was a kid writing my first stories on one of these typewriters than I do now some days. But we both agreed that the way we feel is not the advice we would give to our students. But I think I feel most like a writer and an artist and activist when I'm writing in rebellion of something, which is usually. And when somebody says, you know, you shouldn't write about this thing, or you can't write about this thing, you can't write about this topic, or these people will not be published. When I shift my focus to activism, writing is activism, art is activism, is when I feel like a writer. Like, yes, I will out the person who has assaulted this other person. I will out people who are doing harm in the world. And I will do my best to uplift voices that are being pushed to the side and told they have no place in publishing. So when I kind of put that blazer on, I feel like a writer. But on days when I'm in my pajamas, just typing away, trying to create a world, I usually feel like, what am I doing? Somehow my book is an accident. I always refer to my book as an accident. I'm trying not to, but it feels that way.
Her book is perfect.
Yes, it is.
I think, when I was saying to students, and when I tell my students when I teach, is, if you're writing, you're a writer. And that I really, really believe that for people who are not me. I don't think I felt able to call myself a writer until my first book was published, and I could look at it and see it in bookstores and touch it and be like, you're a baby, and you're in the world, and people are reading you, and what does that mean? Anyway, a lot of anxiety. But I think I don't know, if this audience is an audience of writers, maybe. I think I feel most like a writer in my anxiety. I think about, sometimes I'm like, oh, I need to give everything up. I need to give this up. Drama. And basically my best friend just laughs at me and goes, okay then, Rowan, give it up. See what happens. And I give it up for usually about 2 days. And I realize although I see, and this is why I give my students advice, when I think of myself as a writer, and that being a writer means having a book in a bookstore, I get very frozen out and worried because your words are out there and people are interacting with them and you don't have control. You can tell I'm in therapy. And, but the reason I come to writing is to understand the world and to communicate the best vision I can of the world to people around me, because I often didn't know how to talk to people when I was a child, and I needed to think and figure it out. And that is what makes me write, and that's what begins the process of writing. And so I would like that to be the reason I call myself a writer.
There's an epigraph that opens my book by Anne Carson, The Glass Essay, and it's a part of the glass essay, and it says, "You remember too much, my mother said recently. Why hold on to all that?" And I said, where do I put it down? And that, I think it's not specifically for nonfiction, even though it felt relevant to the memoir, but I think anyone with that feeling, like, where do I put it all down? I carry all this stuff when I'm brushing my teeth in the morning, when I'm showering. It's like all this noise, all this stuff. And I think writers and artists have that in common, this inability to put it down unless we put it into a container that looks like a book or a canvas or whatever that may be.
Into some type of work, that so that you're not only making sense of it for your audience, but you're making sense of it for yourself.
Right, and I think that might sound really obvious to a room full of people who love to read or artists, but I think a lot of people don't deal with that. They don't feel that excess all the time. Just like, oh, I just get through my day, I never thought about that. But there's a rush, there's a crash for us writers, I think, where we need to find something.
There was a story, and I forget how it got started, and maybe one of you read it, about determining whether or not you have an inner monologue, whether there's always a sort of like news ticker in the back of your head with things going on, and every writer that I know was like, oh my God, that's me. And every non-writer was like, what are you all talking about? And so maybe that's...
And then there was later one about some people can imagine pictures and some people see no visual images
Right.
in their brains.
Interesting.
And I really kind of want to be someone with no inner monologue and no pictures. It sounds very peaceful.
Maybe that's what all the meditation apps are for.
I know a brilliant writer who told me she has no inner monologue, but she builds stories piece by piece visually. Like they're colors, and she builds them together, and she can't write the story until she's built the whole thing like blocks. And when she has it, then she writes the whole draft out. She can't do it till then.
That's a fascinating process.
Yeah.
That's incredible. What are some of the stories that, you mentioned Gone with the Wind, what are some of the stories that whether you were represented in some way or whether you just somehow something spoke to you in them? What were some of the stories that were influential in your lives?
I think I'm a writer not because I have a literature degree or because I studied Russian lit in college and love it as much as I'd like to say, oh, I'm a writer because of Gogol. That's not my writing at all. I think I'm a writer because I studied magic tricks as a kid. I took magic classes, cause and effect, patter, distraction, awe, like all of those things I think are my story and writing DNA. I think I'm a writer because of Hawaiian mythology, which I grew up in with my family, family of storytellers, and the Boxcar Children and Encyclopedia Brown were my everything. And I think I'm always rewriting those stories. There's always some sort of mystery. I find Encyclopedia Brown extremely homoerotic. As a scholar of Encyclopedia Brown, Encyclopedia and Bugs Meany, there's many moments of observation of one another that I find inspiring. And the Boxcar Children are kids who feel like outsiders, who are just kind of like building a life of their own outside the status quo. And when I look at my work, and Go Ask Alice. I was reading Go Ask Alice to my wife last year, who's never read it. And I read some passages aloud, and I was like, this silly book that was, kind of a hoax book growing up. And I stopped reading, and we both looked at each other, and she goes, that's your voice. like you've picked up your ear from being a kid reading this book obsessively, that even syllable by syllable and the way the sentences are constructed, my writing is not like Go Ask Alice, but there's something in the ear that I still see when I read those early stories of Boxcar Children, Encyclopedia Brown, and something about, I think, the scale and the magic that still has to do with the construction of magic tricks and also the mythology that surrounded me when I was a kid.
I'm going to go look up Encyclopedia Brown fan fiction after this. Because now you've got me curious.
They're all by me.
And now we see where it really all began. How about you, Rowan? Where did you see yourself in words?
I think weirdly that is something I learned to do as I got older. I think when I was a child, I read obsessively. I used to steal books from my school library. I would give them back, but we had a limit, and I read too fast. And so at the end of the term, I would put them in a pillowcase and then leave them outside the library door and run away. Anyway,
It's the most Rowan story I've ever
heard. You need to send the library a note now explaining that that's what you did, because they've probably been wondering for decades.
The librarian knew because I just used to hide them up my jumper when I was taking them out. I wasn't that subtle, I think. She knew. She must have known. Anyway, and at that age, I was just reading drinking water. It was I just wanted stories. They didn't have to be about me. They were almost always about some plucky young boy in magic. And that was fine by me at the time, and it was actually, and I sort of started reading people like Vonnegut and Agatha Christie, where it's not about children, but there's no Updike and sad marriages yet. Because I wasn't interested in sad marriages because I was 13 and my parents had their own sad marriage and I didn't have to think about that. Do I want to say that on camera? Anyway.
Big unhappiness in Connecticut.
But I think there were moments, there's a book called 20 Fragments of a Ravenous Youth by Xiaolu Guo, and she was writing about in China, and it is quite fragmented and angry, and there's so much feeling, and the climates are so difficult. And I remember being 20 and reading it and being this is everything I've ever felt I want to make. And I'm partially saying this because I get to interview her soon. I'm very excited. Anyway, but I think of reading as a writer as sort of a magpieing of finding the thing that excites you. I'm really I read a lot of detective fiction. I don't write detective fiction, but I think in terms of the why. Detective novel, why was that person murdered? And my first book is this woman left her son. Why did that happen? And in my second book, it starts with a woman on a bridge, and it's the fallout of the police pickup. So I have this detective novel brain in me, even though I really want to write about identity and feelings and paint colors.
You're still solving something.
Yeah. everything fits from here and there.
Yeah, I always tell students, like, the idea, the literary snobbishness of these are the things that should be influential, I just find so problematic, because I do believe in writing and artists and story DNA being those things that excited us to begin with. And I'm so, like, and maybe that's an episode of The Bachelor, and I think there's merit in looking at anything if you're an artist or writer and watching an episode or reading the detective novel and saying, like, what's the craft happening here? How are we still turning the pages? Why are we still watching? Because there is something going on in the editing and the lens and whatever it is that's keeping us engaged. And what is that thing and how can we use it? So yeah, I think if you're writing detective novels, I'm still writing the Encyclopedia Brown Mysteries, and they don't look the same, but we can take things from everything we enjoy and like use that for our own story.
And like when we were talking about students, one thing I was thinking, like I was saying it, like I'm an authority, but I was like also just thinking about it at the time, was that like there were writers like, I love Richard Yates. He's an old white man. I love him. He's great. And I think for a while I had to go through this phase of like loving him and then like rejecting writers like that to make space to write about people who didn't look like they were from Connecticut. And then and then like being able now to go back to his stories and be like, I love what you did there. And to be able to feel like you can take what you need from those places feels really important to me.
Well, and being able to separate what you loved about the work with the obligation to revere or to idolize or some idea of respect. A writer, that you can love someone's work and still quibble with it and still argue with it and still interrogate it.
For sure, and we can write in response to those works. Yeah. We don't have to copycat the work because, you know, the person's on a pedestal. We can write in response. We can write in resistance to those works. But they're still important for us to read, to do that, right?
Yeah.
And even I think about teaching lineage a lot and how Richard Yates was the teacher of Christine Scutt, who was one of my favorite short story writers, and I learned to write sentences from Christine Scutt. So what does it mean that she learned from Richard Yates and Gordon Lish, who I find on camera?
What was the word from a few minutes ago? Problematic.
But I think that's interesting. Like, what's in the syntax? What's in the rhythm? What's thematically happening that's been passed on through time as this kind of memory stutter, this echo that we can pick up in our work and reject in our work, and that's interesting to me. And I don't think we should dismiss what came before or by the people who don't look like us. It feels too simple.
So who are some of the writers working right now, some of your peers, your friends, people you know of that we should all look up and be excited about and add to our incredibly tall stacks of books next to our bedside tables?
Every time I'm asked this question, it's like I've only read one book in my life. Like Encyclopedia Brown.
Yeah. We're going right now. We're going.
I mean, I will just start listing people who are in this book because it's all like many of my favorite writers. But I think there's a nonfiction book called The Collected Schizophrenias by Esme Waiter-Wang, which if you hadn't read it, you maybe should. It's beautiful and it's smart and it's emotional. So definitely go read that. Who else?
Alexander G.
Alexander G.
Both love Alexander G.
Yes. Who has written quite a lot. He's written a book called The Queen of the Night. He's written a book called Edinburgh, and he's written a book of essays called I've read an autobiographical novel.
Linda Berry is probably my favorite writer of all time, who Rowan actually worked with at Madison. She's a Filipino writer, and she does graphic novels and comics, and wrote my favorite novel of all time called Cruddy.
Which she wrote with a paintbrush.
She painted every letter. But everything by Linda Berry. Her craft book, syllabus, what it is, if you need writing prompts and creative prompts, she's amazing for that as well.
What it is
Kawhi Strong Washburn. I'm reading Sharks in the... It's really good. It's new. I don't even know if it's out yet. I think I have a galley. Sharks in the Time of Saviors, about the islands of Hawaii, and it's amazing. It's so good. The language had me literally crying in a couple of pages, and I'd never read his work before, and it's really incredible. It's got a big shark on the cover, and it's bright orange. So that's a new book.
Oh, and we could play this game all night. There's a book called Ponti by a writer named Charlene Teo, who lives in Britain, but it's about Singapore and she's Singaporean, and it's about like horror movies and like creepy mothers and like creepy weird best friends where you kind of hate each other and kind of love each other, and it's like funny and weird, and one of the characters thinks she has a tapeworm. Anyway, I love it.
Do you want more?
We can really
No, we ask everyone who comes through here, you know, who do you love from the past and who do you love working now, because it's so important to kind of see, you know, and sometimes it comes to people while we're talking that like there's a through line of who I used to love to read and who I still love to read, even though the faces and the names have changed.
Someone from the past, her name is Heather Lewis. She's also one of the most important writers in my life. She wrote a book called House Rules. She wrote a full trilogy, but her work after House Rules wasn't really accepted by publishing because it was really dark. It was about sex work and depression, suicide, sexual abuse within the family, just so dark. But she was a brilliant writer. She unfortunately took her own life before the books were published. Only House Rules was published. And then her kind of queer squad of people who supported her and her work got the books posthumously published. This book called Notice, which is incredible, and her trilogy is perhaps the most important collection of work in my whole life. I had never read about queerness in that way before I read Heather Lewis, and she's someone who I think is really historically overlooked, who's really important to me. And there's also, just to give a shout for a book coming out next month, especially because books are, I think, going to struggle in the next few weeks, especially things coming out. There's something called Godshot by Chelsea Beaker. It's a cult novel, and it's incredible. It's one of the best books I've read in the past decade, easy, or in my life. It's really, really, really good. And it's about environmental collapse as well, so it feels really perfect for right now.
Relevant.
Yeah.
Well, would you like to read some of your own work here tonight? We were talking earlier about passages, and we would love to hear you read what you've chosen.
Sure. Would you like to read first?
Okay, from the anthology.
Okay. We're reading from the Go Home Anthology. I'm going to read just a little bit from an essay I have in here called Chicken and Stars, which also appears, Rowan was so generous to publish it in this early stage. A slightly different revised version appears in my book as a chapter, and it's a real downer. I think my book is a little funnier than this section.
I really like this section.
So I'll just read maybe 2 pages. So the piece is about, it's nonfiction. It's about my parents who were struggling with drug addiction at the time, and it's a story about domestic abuse. So this picks up in the middle. He's asleep on the couch when we arrive home. This is his place in our house. My father has never been a bedroom father, a kitchen father, a backyard father, an office father, a roof father. He is a father of the living room couch. I wonder if he was always this way with his other family, that other life none of us are supposed to mention. He keeps a worn photo of 2 boys in the slip of his wallet, boys in the sun playing ball. Even though their faces are crinkled as petals, I can see that they still have his nose. Now my father is face down on the pink leather cushions, and I sit down next to him. His left arm dangles. I lift it and let it drop. He feels dead to me. I love him more than anyone I've ever met. Beneath his arm on the floor is a crown-size ashtray overflowing with orange filters. It's almost beautiful this way, like an exotic flower or a bloomin' onion from the outback. When my father is too drunk to walk or drive, he lights each and every butt in this ashtray. He sucks at them between his fingers like he's drinking a milkshake through a cocktail straw. Around the couch are several empty vodka bottles, a cracked cobalt glass, $100 bills, a smashed mirror. My father doesn't move no matter how much I touch him. I watch my mother fill up a cup with water from the kitchen sink, holding steady to the counter. We use well water here. It smells like cheese water, the kind that collects in the refrigerator drawers, so we plug our noses to drink. My mother points over to our pantry, and I walk over to it. The white door hangs off its hinges like a loose tooth. The shelves inside are split perfectly in half. That's where my face went, she says, all the screws yanked from the walls. I lift a can of Campbell's soup from the pile of them on the floor, chicken and stars, twist it around in my hand. It is easier to look at your favorite soup than it is at blood. Campbell's soup, my every meal, the first thing I learned how to make for myself. A can of Campbell's is exactly 1 pound. It says so on this label, and this is the measurement by which I weigh everything else in this world. I weigh 81 soup cans. My mother stares into the pantry, shaking her head. She sips slow and gently from her glass, careful not to spill. What's all this? I say. My mother points to each shelf, and there are noises now, words coming out between the cry. Money, investment, snapped, pushed, and then soup cans, the money. I ask her to slow down. She says my father's been binging his special stuff and hasn't slept in over 3 days. The fight started in the kitchen, simple at first, before he took her by the wrists and didn't know what to do with all his love. She says things like this all the time lately, words like love to describe our suffering. She doesn't know if I'm old enough to hold the truth in my hands, to measure that. I hug my mother at the kitchen sink, let her cry into my shoulder. She leaves black and blue and red there on my white, crisp school uniform. I'm only 5'2", but we are the same size already. From a slight distance, people mistake us for sisters. I send my mother to her bedroom and tell her I will heat up 2 cans of Campbell's soup for dinner. I pluck them from the top of the pile. I crank the can opener till the aluminum exhales. I smash the pots and pans around, bang them into each other like gongs. The stove coils throb red. The stars boil. I open and close the dishwasher in a crashing swing like I'm bowling. I want my father to wake up so badly, for him to tell me his side of the story, to bury his head in his hands, apologizing, changed. He doesn't move. I'll stop there. It's a funny book.
So I'm going to read a bit from this book, Starling Days, which looks like this in Britain. It actually will look different in America. It is coming out.
It's coming out really soon, and this is the book to pre-order. It's so good. I wish it were here tonight.
Well, my first book is if you want to make me very happy. But I thought I would read from it because I wanted, I guess, for you guys to get to know me a bit as a writer, because I talked about my editing project. And so this is very shortly after the beginning. So all you really need to know is that Mina is standing on George Washington Bridge and looking down. The river was as dark as poured tarmac. They said that when a body fell into water from this height, it was like hitting sidewalk. The Golden Gate had nets to stop jumpers. She imagined the feeling of a rope cutting into arms and legs. Your body would flop like a fish. How long did they have to lie there before someone scooped them out? There was nothing like that here. People said that drowning was a good death, that the tiny alveoli of the lungs filled like 1,000 water balloons. She lifted one purple flip-flop and dropped it over the water. She didn't hear it hit. The shape simply vanished into the black shadow. That was when the lights got brighter and the voice, male and certain, lobbed into her ears. "Ma'am, step away from the rail." The police car's lights flashed blue and white and red. Once she'd had an ice pop those colors, and the sugary water had pooled behind her teeth. "Ma'am, step away from the rail." "Good evening, officer. Have I done something wrong?" Mina asked. "Please get into the car," he said. There were 2 of them. The other was younger, and he was speaking into a radio. It was hard to make out his words over the wind and traffic. Was he talking about her? "This is a public walkway," Mina said. "It was open. I haven't done anything wrong." "Ma'am, get into the car." "I don't want to get into the car. Look, I was just getting some air. I was thinking I'll go home now." Ma'am, don't make me come over there. Mina had never been in a police car. She'd read once that the back doors only open from the outside. Who knew what would happen if she got into the car? The window was rolled down and the cop stuck his head out. There was a lump on his upper lip, a pimple perhaps. Where are your shoes? It's hot out, she said. Where are your shoes? I don't want to tell you about my shoes, she said. I haven't done anything wrong. I'm an American citizen. Ma'am, where are your shoes? She lifted up the single flip-flop she had left. The other one broke, she said. Behind him, other cars continued into the night. Did they even notice her standing in the dark, a small woman with bare legs and feet? She was aware of the bluing bruise she'd caught banging her knee on the subway door. In the shower that morning, she'd skipped shaving her legs. In the beam of his headlamps, could he see hairs standing up in splinters? Ma'am, I really need you to get into the car. I can't leave you here. What if something happened to you? In his voice, she heard the insinuation that normal women, innocent women, didn't walk alone on bridges at night. I'm fine, she said. Mina knew her stubby ponytail was frizzy. Bleaching black to Marilyn Monroe blonde had taken 4 rounds of peroxide. Now it stood up in breaking strands. If she'd conditioned it, would this cop think she was sane? If she'd blow-dried it, would he let her go home? And of course, there were the tattoos twining up her arms. We can talk about it in the car, he said. His shadowed friend was bent over the radio, lips to the black box. Mina was tired. It was the heat, or perhaps the wind. So she got into the car. The seat was smooth. Someone must have chosen the fabric specially. This must be wipeable and disinfectable. People probably spat on this seat. They probably pissed on purpose and by mistake. Between the front and back seats was a grill. She would not be able to reach out to touch the curve of the cop's ear or straighten his blue collar. The flip-flop lay across her knees. The cops wanted to know her name, address, phone number, and social security. She gave them. We're taking you to Mount Sinai, said the cop. I was just going for a walk, clearing my head. I don't need to be in hospital. I was just clearing my head. Damn, repeating yourself is a habit of the guilty. Mina tried to slow her breath. See it from my point of view, he said. You're walking alone on the bridge at night. I can't let you out. I don't know what would happen. Only then did she understand they must do this every night. Drive back and forth across the bridge, looking for people like her. Thank you. I also promise there are more lighthearted moments. She read it. It's true.
Should we take a few questions?
Yeah.
So I have a question about the editing. I saw in the documents that there were also 500 submissions.
Yeah.
Is there anything about the final product that you find surprising compared to when you first envisioned it?
That's a really good question. I think it became so particular itself. I feel like it didn't feel surprising by the end because we had to make so many decisions along the way. One of them was that the poetry is pretty obviously poetry, but we didn't mark fiction versus non-fiction in this book. We didn't say they couldn't say that. So here's a memoirist, and that's apparent. It wasn't a trick, but we felt like so often Asian American writers were asked, sort of, is this true? Is this what you're accounting for? Is this what you're standing up for? We wanted to let people make the decisions, and in some cases it's very clear, and the things are more journalistic. In some cases, it's less obviously so. And that was a very gradual decision that I made, talking to different people. It was definitely also a book that I made. There was an editor at the Feminist Press, and there was a person at the Asian American Writers Workshop, both of whom put in hours and hours and hours of work. And I asked them, like, do you want to be on the cover? Please be on the cover if you want to be on the cover. And I was like, no. And I was like, why? And they each brought their own lens to it. So I knew it was really important to me that this book have East and South Asian writers, because I grew up in Britain where Asian meant South Asian, and I remember feeling left out by that, but equally I know many South Asian people and writers in the US were very left out and unincluded by Asian, so I knew I wanted to do that. But Jyoti said, yes, you've included lots of South Asian writers in this first early draft, but I think we only had one Muslim writer, and she was like, the South Asian writers are very Hindu, so a lot of it was being in conversations with my community and learning what we needed to do, because while we knew we couldn't represent someone from every single country, we wanted it to feel inclusive and to feel like if your story wasn't there, there was at least some part of your identity or something that you could feel that you could be. You could write your own piece into this anthology, if that makes sense. And getting there was work and time, I think. So, yeah, I don't think it was like a shock type of surprise, but it was a discovery, I think, as I went. Well, yeah, I didn't know I would get 500 submissions. And they also wrote these really moving letters about why they were writing them and why they needed this book, and I cried. Because I read them all. I read every single submission. I was like, can we publish them all? And no, we couldn't, but I hope they found homes elsewhere. Yeah. Any other questions?
As Rowan was saying, listening to you talk about what inspired you and stuff was, like, you said time to sit with it. Thing you were talking about, like, and I guess things you would think about silly stuff from childhood to inspire you, because I think you cling to those things and you look back on them later, especially like if you're, wow, why does this matter to you? Like you're talking about technically around, like you're an adult, and you look back and why this mattered to you as a queer person. I think it's sillier stuff that I kind of do. So thanks for talking about your craft. And is there other stuff? I like to be talking about the Bachelor, whatever that you think that outside of just books to kind of just take inspiration from one another, even for people who aren't writers who might inspire to be, or I guess for both of you, to say that that's not just reading. That makes sense, right?
Yeah, it does. It makes a lot of sense. I love movies and television, and I'm a jazz fanatic. I used to be a drum player as well, so I think I don't write about music, but I think or hope that there's something percussive in the way that I write, and I think that influences my ear for sure. I listen to jazz every day, and movies I think is just, and we can be dismissive about movies and television, like, oh, but it's not a book. I'm like, no, but it's the fastest, easiest way to consume narrative and to see narrative shape. So for me, I'm always asking, no matter what it is, like, what is the setup and payoff, and how does the thing keep our attention? What is the surprise in whatever it is? Whether it's a plate of food, which I love food and I love cooking, and that's a big part of my process, or a book or a movie. Where are the surprises? Because usually for me, it's within the surprises that make something great. And that's what I'm always after in my work, so I try to learn from those kind of side steps from the expected, if that makes sense.
It does.
Yeah.
Well, like, what movies do you like now or in the past? Like, I think about a movie like Parasite. That kind of struck everybody as being really powerful.
Yeah, Parasite is the movie I'm thinking about right now, that I'm teaching right now. I teach Moonlight every semester. We read the screenplay and then we watch it. I teach something called Stories We Tell. It's a documentary that kind of turns on its head at the end. The Lives of Others is a film we watch. A Separation from Iran. And Hannah Gatsby's Stand Up Nanette has a really interesting structure to me. I teach classes in structure in literature because it's something that I feel I don't have a really strong foundation with, and so I want to continue learning every single week with my classes of, like, how is this made? What's the architecture? What's the scaffolding beneath the thing? And that's why I teach that class, so I can be reminded every week how things work. But it's important for me to look at, even though I teach nonfiction and memoir, I'm always bringing in poems, I'm always bringing in songs, I'm bringing in films and screenplays, and looking at how a screenplay translates to the actual screen, and like how a certain color or a composition of a shot might be really surprising in that transcription. And because that's what we're doing as writers, is we're transcribing something here, right? So I think it's important to think visually and to think about narrative and look at both for me.
I mean, that was a beautiful answer. I want to go to your structure classes.
Rowan's also a brilliant visual artist, for anyone who doesn't know that.
But I think it's funny what you're saying about movies, because I always think I should read screenplays, and I must admit I don't often. But I think what movies freed me up to do is the way scene transitions work. Like, I feel like when you're young and you're writing life, there's often like, and then I need to tell you how I got from my bedroom to the kitchen, and wait, like a week of boring things happens before the exciting thing happens, and like how much do I need to account for? And I think one of the things about movies is they actually trust the watcher a lot. Like, you'll cut and you'll be in a different place or with a different character, and as long as that's made clear by that first new image, everyone's quite happy to go along with you, and to think about where you want to start. Like, often movies don't start necessarily, at the beginning. You'll start in medias res, and like books do that too, obviously. But it was very freeing for me when I realized that I was seeing that in film, and I was seeing that in very accessible films. So it wasn't that I was asking the reader to do that much. I wasn't asking this big impossible thing. So I think there's that for me. I think I read a lot of graphic novels. I couldn't tell you exactly how that turns into writing, but I love graphic novels. They are books. I realized you said non-books things, and graphic novels are books, damn it. But I think, again, actually, maybe what I would say is often the information you're getting in a graphic novel is not just the plot. Right? People go to a graphic novel because it's beautiful, because of the craft, because of the way it is structured, with a vision of people that isn't, and often those people are not like perfect realism. Right? You have come to see a particular vision of the world, and I think that is something that feeds me as a writer, to know that that is something that people want and need, to be in your atmosphere, whatever that is, if it's visual or not visual. And I guess I write a lot about art. There's like an art blogger in here who's kind of pretentious, but like kind of, there's like a scene where like they go and watch an art film and then like their fingers touch. So I guess there's that too. And my first novel, each chapter transition started with a paint color, and a description of a paint color, because that character was not a very wordy person. It's hard to write about a not wordy person using words. And so I was thinking about how that character thinks, and I felt like she's an artist and she thinks in color, because to me color has a lot of feeling and emotion, and so colors became how I began it. So I think it's less organized than yours. I want to be as organized as that, but it's more this like inspiration that goes back and forth between different mediums.
Thank you.
Thank you for asking. That was such a good question.
I love the show Euphoria. I was just telling somebody about it
Let's
earlier.
come back, yeah.
Yeah, so that's one I always want to shout out. I love this like tragic Shakespearean scale of these teenage stories. Feels really good to me to watch.
What's your ideal writing setting? What are you surrounded by? What are you looking at? What are you drinking? What's that scenario that sort of helps that all those words tumble out?
We were just talking about this extensively today. I'm extremely superstitious when it comes to my desk and my routine, which isn't to say that I don't have days where I'm on the train or, here in a hotel or writing from bed, because I certainly have those days. But if I'm doing a long, 6-hour day or longer, which I like to do to really get work done if I can. I'm a sprinter, not a jogger. I like to say I'm not the person who needs to write every day, but I need a long stretch of time, maybe once a week or even once a month if things get really crazy. But when I have those days, I have my ritual. I have my desk. I have the same candle I've been burning forever that I can only burn if I'm writing. And I have a lava lamp, and it works as a metronome, working up and down for me for timing. I have photos everywhere. I have the kid photo of me. I have photos of family. I have cultural references if I'm writing about a certain era. My book is largely about the 90s, and it was just covered in like the 1996 Olympics and Las Vegas in the 90s, and covers of Tiger Beat magazine. So I like pictures everywhere. I like clippings everywhere. I have next to me always some charts from a book called Save the Cat, which is a screenplay writing book, which shows basic story arc charts. So if I'm just feeling stuck, I'll look up and see like, who's the big bad guy? This could come here. And I don't always follow those structures of screenplays, but I find them helpful if I'm stuck, to just see like, okay, like what's the basic mechanics of how to get from A to B. And I like a lot of rocks. I have a brick that I hold, and I drink a lot of tea.
That is sufficient.
So I have two versions of my writing place. Sometimes I write in bed, which is very bad for sleep rituals, but it's like my way of tricking myself that I'm not really working and I'm not really writing. It's just like I've just woken up and these are just some thoughts, because a lot of my writing process is me lying to myself about my writing process, which is questionable. But when I'm at my desk, ideally I want to be by a window. I don't need particular objects on my desk. I tried, because many writers I admire do like burn a candle or do a particular thing, and I would always forget to do it. But I like to be looking in a window, not a wall. It makes me feel a certain like sense of expansiveness in my work. It also provides for me like the correct amount of distraction. Like my emails are the wrong amount of distraction, then I'm gone. But like the weird seagulls that live near my house, despite the fact it's not near the ocean, are like, oh, you're there. Or like kids passing by hitting the railings. It's not enough that it distracts me from my inner distractions, if that makes sense, and it breaks rhythm and brings new things into me. I drink a lot of tea, which is very classy and writerish. I also drink a lot of Diet Coke, which is much less so. You always know in a movie if someone is like not good news if they drink Diet Coke. It's just like they're gonna you. Yeah, I drink a lot of that. But yeah, so and I often write in a notebook before I write type it up, because I find that helps me edit. Sometimes if I've forgotten to bring my notebook, I write in the backs of the book I'm reading, which I know is a very people really go one way or the other on that as a life choice. And sometimes that means that I forget that I've done it, and I'm like looking through that book later, and I'm like, oh, this was a terrible idea for a short story. Oh, but I like that sentence, which I don't know, that's quite nice. So yeah.
I also write on
Go.
I write on a typewriter before I transcribe onto a computer. All my first drafts are on that Postman Corona right over there, because it helps with pacing. It's not too fast, it's not too slow. It helps with sound for me. I like the thunder of the keys, and I was explaining earlier, when I transcribe pages from a typewriter to a computer, it forces a second draft that I wouldn't otherwise maybe do. And it forces you to really challenge every single sentence as you're transcribing onto the computer, and then rewrite them so that they sound better. Whereas if I'm looking at a screen, there's something about it that feels a little final to me, and I might get lazy and like read through it and not see what I would see transcribing from one medium to the other. So if that is of interest to you, get a typewriter. Do it, or write by hand and transcribe. Like just having that second draft being the one on the computer can be really helpful.
I know a writer, this is horrifying to me. She's like a very successful writer in Britain, published. She wrote her entire draft of her novel, and then she deleted it in every font from every computer, and then just started again. Because she said she wanted to like have it be clean, and that there was too much figuring it out, and she didn't want any of her old words. But it's the same novel, the same characters, and the same plot. My mind, anyway. I couldn't do this, but if you do it, please, like, I don't know, hit me up on some form of social media, tell me how it went.
I did it with a story once by accident. I lost the story.
Do you think it worked?
It did, because I rewrote it and then I compared, and what I rewrote was much better because I only remembered the sentences and moments that were really good, and the rest was silly. And then I was like, oh, I should do this all the time, but I will not. Again.
We've got time for one more question.
So I know a lot of writing is rewriting, but how do you both start?
Like where do you get like where does that flame come that starts what actually comes to fruition? Makes sense, right?
I'll start. Why not? I think sort of one of two ways. Sometimes it is in that like slightly mystical like writer thing, like it was a vision, it came into my head, I had to write about it. But even if that's true, it's like usually an image and I need to write into my understanding of it. And often what I'm writing is to write to discover. I think sometimes, especially with shorter work though, there's something weird in the world and I want to talk about it. Like I just had a short story accepted that began because of like a phone game that had like Japanese demons like fighting each other, and the demons are like a folding screen that you didn't take good enough care of, so it became a demon, or the umbrella you didn't repair, so it became a demon. I'm like, this is a real game, you could play it. I mean, you could waste a lot of time, but you could do it. But I sort of started thinking about that, and it ended up being this story about this girl and her brother who's being bullied and who's obsessed with this game, and it developed into this whole world, but I needed like something very specific and grounding. Like sometimes I think I largely write literary realism, whatever that means, and sometimes people think that's sort of out of a snobbishness, but it's not. If you can imagine an entire kingdom like ruled by dragons, I am actually in awe of you. I need to start with something weird and nuggety in this world and then build my fiction around it, if that makes sense.
I think for me, I approach the craft of fiction and nonfiction the same way, sentence by sentence, but I do think they come from different energy sources in my body. So I think identifying what your energy source is can be really helpful. So for me, I was able to figure out all of my nonfiction is coming from a place of grief and loss, and all of my fiction is coming from a place of desire. So, and that could be desire, like sexual desire, romantic desire, but also like desire for this life I've never lived, or this what if scenario. And those things can certainly have crossover, but if I'm feeling something, it's identifying what kind of side it's on of those two things. And again, the crossover is interesting to me, and usually fiction is where I go if I have a big burning question that might live in the nonfiction world that I'm not ready to really wrestle with in nonfiction yet. So for example, like when my father died, I thought a lot about like what would I ask him if I got the chance to ask him a question before he died. And then I found out about all these new siblings I had after he was dead. And I didn't know how to make sense of that. And it appears in my memoir, but I was still not ready to write that book yet. So I wrote a short story instead where I was able to blow up and exaggerate those questions and concerns that I wasn't ready to write about. So in the fiction story, a character gets a pamphlet in the mail and it says, your biological father is dead because he was a donor. Come to this convention center kind of theme park where you get to meet all your siblings for Who's Your Daddy conference. So this character goes, she meets like hundreds of people in Las Vegas, and the dad actually shows up as a corpse, and they're all able to ask him one question, and he will respond to them. So that's the premise of the story. So it's taking the very literal questions I had in my life and then exaggerating them and making them fun. So I think that's how I start, is with questions. And as an actual tool of how to start on a smaller scale, I can't start without a word bank next to me. So as I'm reading and writing, I'm always circling words that I find interesting. And those aren't necessarily big words that I need to look up. Sometimes they are. But usually it's just seeing a word that I don't use enough. I think we tend to reach for the same words over and over again that are just living in our head. And sometimes I was reading Michael Cunningham recently, and he described someone's jacket in the snow as being studded by snow. And I was like, that's so lovely. You can see the spots of snow, studded. I love the sound of that. I don't use the word stud or studded. So those go in my word bank. And then when I sit down to write, whatever it is, I say, okay, let's use 5 or 10 of these words in the first page. And it just gets me generating sentences just to get them in there. And I can't just start here. I need words.
Can I speak to something you said in the middle of that? Because I think it was really interesting and I don't see it talked about enough, which is the what if thing. Because I think that's the other big thing for me, is often when something the most autobiographical things in my fiction are the least autobiographical because they're the what if, which I find really inspiring. It's the what if this thing went in another direction. So my first book, Honest Like You, is a book about, as I said, like a Japanese American artist who leaves her child. My mom is a half Japanese, half Chinese woman who stayed at home and raised me, and every other week said, like, I'm gonna leave. And I love her. And she's not the main character of that book, but I had this question of like, okay, well, why would you leave? What would it have taken to make you leave? How would things have been slightly different? Like, I don't think you would have been an evil person. Does that path look like? And so that story alternates with that character has a son, a mixed-race son, and who's trying to figure out who his mother was, and he didn't grow up with her. So there's a sort of what happens in this case. This story is almost entirely, like, very many things happen in this book that did not happen to me, but the opening basically did. And I wasn't about to bridge, but I was standing and I got picked up by the police, and my best friend came and got me and was made to sign a form that said he took responsibility for me for the rest of whatever, I don't know, I didn't see the form. And I sat on that for a long, long time, and I only even wrote about that in nonfiction much later for an essay to talk about this book. But it wasn't that then what happened was my life. What happened was I thought, okay, but what if you didn't have someone to come pick you up? Or what if the person who came to pick you up was not your friend who would then go to his home and you would go to your home? What if it was your husband? And what if you took that literally? What if you said, I am taking responsibility for you and your brain? How would that go? What would that look like? Who are these other people? What would this different path look like? And I think for me that can often be where the most powerfully emotional writing to me comes from, because it is both grounded in you and has the option for imagination and for exploration and development where you're not. I don't know.
Yeah.
Thank you both for your stories, for your time, for being here with us tonight. As I mentioned earlier, the authors will be signing in the back in light of, I think, what we're all calling the current situation. We're just going to ask that you, if you do take photographs, that you not come around the table and that you use your own phone, that you don't hand them around or ask anyone else to hold them. We do have hand sanitizer around the front for afterwards when you're on your way out. And if you don't yet have a book, you can get one from Seminary Co-op in the back. But thank you all very much for coming out tonight. Thank you.